truly though, who isn't massively interested in the history of prison ships? Welcome back everyone, I'm Emilee Harris, author of STEAMY Historical Romances, and today we are delving into the topic of the prison ship. As mentioned in my introduction to my book, Courting the Enemy, our hero is introduced to us via a prison ship where he is locked up for the duration. I can't exactly remember how I came across prison ships as a theme, but I know it has come up in other researching I have done. For example, things like themed ships, maybe not specifically themed, but that ended up themed in history, like certain groups of people going to a certain place for a certain reason. And that includes things like indentured servants, colonists, penal transport for prisoners, all of that. And the idea of these prison ships actually was recently reinforced for me in a new project as well, as I was looking into the potential sentencing for various legal infringements. So if you get sent to trial, if you get arrested in Regency England, what were the repercussions based off of what the crime was? On the upside, it was pretty simple. You commit a crime, basically either you get hanged or you get transported. Those are your options. Possibly go to debtor's prison. And without getting too far off topic, because I'm sure this will come up later, let me go back to the prison ships. So, prison ships have been a thing at various points throughout history, and even still, I believe, today and in some parts of the world. But they're pretty interesting. They had their heyday during the late 18th century into very early 19th century in Great Britain, specifically because this was the time from about, I want to say like the 1750s on, there were a massive amount of laws or legal, basically crimes added to the official register of what constitutes a crime. And Great Britain experienced this issue of now we have a penal code that has massively expanded, but we have not expanded our punishments for different crimes. As mentioned earlier, the punishments for basically everything from stealing a loaf of bread to murder was either you get hanged, you get killed, or you get transported. And the reason actually for the transport started because the prisons and jails were becoming overcrowded. This was all of the new crimes and people being locked up. All of this was amounting to an overpopulation in the system that they had as far as prisons and jails. That overpopulation, they needed to do something about it, so they began transporting prisoners. And initially, prisoners would be transported to the colonies. And for a long time, that included what is now the United States, but the American colonies. And that goes into an interesting little side segue of history as well. But they would be transported to the Americas, and of course when the United States or when the American colonies had their Revolutionary War, their war for independence, that kind of put the stymie on the transport of prisoners. Because of that, the English started focusing more on prison ships. So they had the actual buildings which were becoming overcrowded. And now you also had, they had to think of what are the options. Well, we have ships that have been decommissioned, no longer in use. These included very often Royal Navy ships and also fairly often privately owned ships, which were no longer used actively going out to sea, but they were then docked somewhere at a port, in a port or in a river, in a sufficiently big river. For example, the Thames. There were several prison ships along the Thames in England. And these ships, or prison hulks as they were called, or are more accurately called, then became the new prisons. And these ships were notorious for their absolute horrible treatment of prisoners. In fact, and here's where I'm going to delve in a little bit to American history as well, because that was what I found the most information on. But here it is. Okay. As History.com describes it, these ships were a floating receptacle of human misery. Is that not the greatest description? During the American Revolution, these prison ships took on a whole new use as almost like a modern day psychological warfare. They were known for being brutal. And almost immediately when the war started, the British were using these prison ships off the American eastern coast. Specifically, there were, well, in the south, off of Georgia, I think there were a couple in further north, New York, Long Island, those areas you had prison ships, and captured American soldiers were put onto the prison ships. And it is said, I've seen this in multiple articles, that more colonist Americans died as prisoners of war on British prison ships through intentional neglect than died in every battle of the war combined. So these were not nice places, these prison ships. And while I represent this prison ship a little bit better in my book, I have it outfitted more as just a lousy jail, where it's crowded, it's not great, but I don't focus on the actual prison ship itself because I very quickly get my character off of said ship and into the story I had planned for him. Even so, I found it to be a very interesting kind of side note of history that we don't hear much about. Okay, so we had prisons getting overcrowded, we were transporting prisoners, we had the prison ships during the American Revolution, which was just prior to the time, the Regency era of my books. And so what happened? Well, in not too long of a period, you had the same problem happen again with the prison ships that happened with the prisons, meaning, or specifically, they were overcrowded. So now England, Great Britain had to come up with something else, and luckily they discovered Australia. They were thinking, it's pretty hot and miserable down there. That would make a good penal colony. So, right around there, when the Americas were no longer a great option, was when they started looking to Australia as a secondary option for transport of prisoners, and that's basically what happened. So, even though there was a brief period in which transport wasn't happening, the continued overcrowding necessitated that they start the transport again, which they did in the early 1800s, I believe. That is a very brief overview of prison ships, but I wanted to chat about it because I thought it was massively interesting, and it did give me a starting point into looking at other ways that ships were used to transport people and to discipline people and how it kind of created a unique history in different parts of the world. So anyway, thank you again for hanging out with me for this little trivial tidbit. I hope you enjoyed it, and please do let me know if you have any other interesting information about the prison ships that you think I'd like to know. I'm always up to hear it. So if you enjoyed today's trivial tidbit, please do remember to like and or subscribe to the video and channel, and I will see you next week. Until then, happy reading.